Good evening, and welcome to our lecture, Rethinking China, Shifting Global Goals and Ambitions. My name is Tiff Roberts, and I am a Mansfield Fellow at the University of Montana. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Mansfield Center, as well as show a short video commemorating the 50th anniversary of U.S. Senator Mike Mansfield's 1972 visit to China. But first, an acknowledgement. The University of Montana acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of the U.S. Congress in 1983, but functions as an autonomous academic unit of the University of Montana, responsible for its own funding and for its own programs. Among our core priorities is educating the American people about the history and current relations between the United States and the people of Asia. The center builds upon Senator Mike Mansfield's legacy of statesmanship, ethical leadership, and bipartisanship to address the challenges our world faces today. Our work fosters a national dialogue of civility to restore trust in our national institutions, founding documents, and leaders. The 50th anniversary of Senator Mansfield's official trip to China, which was in April and May of 1952, presents us an opportunity to reflect on the history of U.S. China relations in the past half century, as well as contemplate the path forward for two of the world's leading powers. We have prepared, as I said, a short video to commemorate that visit.
Mike Mansfield was among the few American political leaders of his time who recognized China's re-emerging importance on the world stage. In May 1922, as a 19-year-old Marine, he was briefly deployed to China. This exposure led to an intense personal interest and eventual study of Asia. Leaving the military for work in the copper mines of Butte, Montana, Mansfield was encouraged by his wife, Maureen Hayes Mansfield, to earn his high school equivalency and degree in Far Eastern history at the University of Montana. In 1937, Mansfield began teaching about Asia at the university. Mansfield's political career began in 1942 when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. As a junior congressman, Mansfield won President Roosevelt's approval for an official trip to China in late 1944, where he met Chiang Kai-shek and other top officials. Mansfield believed that a strong China was in America's interest and pushed for aid to the country. Mansfield supported the U.S. policy of containing communism. As Senate Majority Leader, however, he privately advised President Johnson not to seek a military victory in Vietnam, realizing that Communist leader Ho Chi Minh had mobilized the power of nationalism, the most powerful force in post-World War II Asia. President Nixon ended more than 20 years of economic and political isolation between China and the U.S. in February 1972. The new era of peaceful relations would not have been possible without Mike Mansfield, who provided important support for the opening. Following a 3-week official visit with Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott in April and May 1972, Mansfield stressed the positive aspects of China's economic and social growth. Overlooking the devastation of the ongoing Cultural Revolution, Mansfield concluded that China, quote, has become a viable modern society with an approach to social participation and responsibility which is rooted in the past, meets the needs of the present, and offers a soundly based hope for the future. As the longest-serving U.S. ambassador to Japan under Presidents Carter and Reagan, Mansfield continued to have a strong interest in China. He watched as Deng Xiaoping launched reform and opening to the world until the Tiananmen Massacre of June 4th, 1989, crushed hopes for political reform. In 1999, veteran Washington Post journalist David Broder referred to Mansfield as the man who may be the greatest living American. That description fit the modest statesman who rose from poverty to international acclaim while continuing to faithfully serve the citizens of Montana and the nation. His death on October 5th, 2001, came just 2 months before China joined the World Trade Organization, a giant step towards becoming a global power. Mansfield's far-sighted vision of a world in which the U.S. and China could peaceably coexist and mutually benefit guides us as we seek to cooperate with China to solve environmental, economic, and geopolitical issues, while we in the U.S. work to maintain democratic institutions and universal human values that China's current leaders both reject and renounce.
I am truly honored to introduce tonight's speakers, two of the most interesting thinkers on China who have an unparalleled level of insight into China's leaders, their goals and ambitions for China and for the world. Lingling Wei is the chief China reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She is also the co-author of the must-read book, Superpower Showdown. Lingling and I were both reporters at the same time a number of years ago in China, where she was known for constantly scooping the rest of the foreign press corps, myself included. And there was much envy for her ability to get the story and get it before the rest of us. One example that comes to mind when I think about that involved a reporting trip that I did to a place called Zhejiang, next to Shanghai, known for its private enterprise. And I was down there doing a story on how the private entrepreneurs then of China were facing tremendous challenges as Beijing shut down their source of shadow finance. I remember thinking I was about to interview someone that no one else in the foreign press corps had interviewed and have a scoop. And I went into this dusty old building in the city of Wenzhou, Zhejiang, and the first person I saw was Lingling, and Lingling was sitting and interviewing that head of an enterprise association that I had gone down to for my big scoop. So not only did she get the story before me, but I had to sit and wait for her to finish her interview before I could even start. We are very privileged tonight to hear from Elizabeth Economy. Liz is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. She's now serving as a senior advisor to the Commerce Department. Earlier this year, she published her latest book, The World According to China, which is a tremendously illuminating look at the global ambitions of China's top leaders. And it's really based on her unparalleled access to key actors in China. I see it as a guidebook to this rising superpower and how the world might try to deal with its rise. If you haven't already read The World According to China, I highly advise you to go and get a copy and read it right away. One of the last times I met Liz face-to-face was also in China, in the northeastern city of Dalian. We were both there for a World Economic Forum's annual meeting in China, what they like to call the Summer Davos. And we had both left the venue for the meeting at the same time and were sharing a cab back to our respective hotels. And I remember very vividly that I was aware, having done the drive a number of times, that I had about 30 minutes in the cab in which I could try to speak very quickly and ask Liz as many questions as I could about China to try to tap into her huge knowledge of Chinese politics and economics. Well, I'm delighted that today we actually have a full hour to hear the insights of Liz and also Lingling on China. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Lingling. The floor is yours, Lingling.
Thank you very much, Tiff, for the very generous introduction and for the invite. It's truly my honor to be here to moderate this discussion with Liz. You know, her, as Tiff mentioned, her insights and her analysis are just so unparalleled, one of the sharpest minds on China. Just a few days ago, I was in DC and I was meeting with some officials at the Chinese embassy. You know, one of them was very new in town in DC, and on top of his list of people he wants to meet was Liz. Anyway, just really honored to be here. So because you know, I'm sure there are lots of questions from both from me and from the audience that we want to ask Liz about. So I'm just gonna get it started. Truly, the world calling to China is really a must read if you really want to understand China's intentions and ambitions, especially under President Xi Jinping. So the first question for you, Liz, is that, you know, there's very little doubt in the U.S. these days that China's rise poses a challenge to the United States and what the United States stands for. But there are still some debates over what China's intentions are. You know, some scholars here in the U.S. have argued that all that the Chinese leadership is trying to do is to create a stable external environment for China, and China has no intention to replace the U.S. You argue in your book that China has both the ambition and the wherewithal to actually transform the international system. Could you tell us how you arrived at that conclusion? What's the biggest difference you see in China's approach to the world under Xi Jinping today versus previous leaderships? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lingling. It really is just a pleasure, a real pleasure and honor to be here with you and also with Tiff. And I do want to thank the Mansfield Center for inviting me. I just want to make one quick point, and that is that I had the opportunity to just read through Senator Mansfield's report after he returned from China that he presented to Congress. And I was just struck when I read it by how even-handed and how open-minded he was, and how he seemed to really enjoy, almost revel in the opportunity to walk among the Chinese people, you know, to accompany a doctor to, you know, various locations. And he talked about the environment and a lot of sort of the social issues. And I just thought this is the kind of work, you know, for which both you and, you know, Tiff are renowned, and that, you know, I in my earlier stage when I used to work on China and the environment also really love to do, and how important it is in some respects just to remember the humanity of China, even as the relationship between our two countries has become so challenging. So in any case, I just wanted to just offer that as some kind of a link in some respects to the man whom we are, I think, in some respects honoring this evening. But to your very big and important question, you know, why do I arrive at the conclusion that Xi Jinping wants to transform, you know, China's place in the world, and in the process also really transform, you know, the international system? You know, there's not much of a mystery, and frankly, it puzzles me why more people can't see it. And I know you see it. So, you know, if you read his speeches and if you look at the actions that China, you know, takes on the ground, to me, they match up, you know, very clearly. First of all, Xi Jinping is a leader who really does try to do what he says. You know, in the beginning, I think he was kind of, you know, Xi Jinping, man of mystery. I don't think there's much mystery around him these days. You know, his priorities, he says, you know, Taiwan, reunification with Taiwan is one of his, you know, 14 must-do items, right? Why shouldn't we believe that? right? We see the types of policies that he's taking, around Taiwan. We see the assertiveness in the South China Sea. We know that sovereignty is a priority area for China. He says it and he backs it up with actions. I mean, just look at what happened in the first 6 months of COVID. Not only, China had its first deadly border conflict with India, but China called, on a sort of a territorial dispute in Bhutan, right? They're sailing into Malaysian and Indonesian waters. They're pressing, around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands for 100 days in a row. So very assertive action, right? Again, around all these sovereignty issues that he considers paramount. Pressing out from there, does China want to replace the United States? I would say this, in the Indo-Pacific, I think, yes, China wants to replace the United States as the preeminent power. It talks a lot about Asia is for Asians to govern. I don't think he means Japan should be governing Asia. He creates institutions that don't include the United States. He talks about the need for the dissolution of the US-led alliance system, that it's anachronistic and anti-China, a relic of the Cold War. When he's trying to negotiate a code of conduct around the South China Sea with the other claimants, one of the conditions that he tried to put forth was that, there could be no military exercises by an outside power unless all the actors, to the code of conduct agreed. And of course, that's just to keep the United States out. So I don't think there's any doubt that Xi Jinping views China as sort of the natural heir, to the Indo-Pacific, to the leadership position in the Indo-Pacific. And then again, moving out from there, what do we see with the Belt and Road Initiative, this giant infrastructure initiative? It's morphed and evolved to a digital Silk Road, to a health Silk Road, to now there's a kind of green Silk Road, there's a polar Silk Road, and all of these have embedded in them, right, China's efforts to not only, build infrastructure, but, shape norms and values. Have cybersecurity seminars, teach other countries that are interested in how to do real-time censorship of the internet. China established its first military logistics base in Djibouti. It's going to have more military bases. We know that, right? The military officials have called for more military bases. China is asserting itself in many respects in ways, very traditional power ways, in some respects, in ways that it said it never would. And then finally, we see China at the level of global governance looking to, as we say, lead in the reform of the global governance system, transform norms and values so that they reflect Chinese priorities and Chinese values. And you may say, well, China is the second largest economy in the world, largest trading power, has the largest military, has the largest population. Why wouldn't it want to have a much larger role on the global stage? And that's true, right? But then acknowledge that, right? So again, for those people that say that China isn't trying to change the world around it, I think all you really have to do, again, just read his speeches and look at what he's doing on the ground.
Very good answer here, and you convinced me for sure. So we will touch upon the Belt and Road Initiative a little more later. Yes, Xi Jinping has that grand ambition. So what do you think really drives him? When he says that China should lead in the reform of the global governance system, as you wrote in your book, what do you think really drives him to make such bold calls, and how he's been pushing that agenda around the world? You mentioned Belt and Road, and any other initiatives you can mention here.
Sure. I mean, I think it reflects a couple of different ideas in some respects. So on the one hand, I think, you can look, for example, during the Olympics when, he and Putin, stood up together, right, and kind of said, time for a new world order, right? That old rules-based order, that's basically been dominant since the, end of World War II, sort of the post-World War II liberal international order that was created in large measure by market democracies, right, to reflect the values of market democracies. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin want a different, set of rules to govern, right? They don't value above all things like individual rights, right? That's not a Chinese, Communist Party value, right? They have a much more state-centered conception of rights. So you see China in the United Nations working very hard, right, to transform general understandings of what constitutes human rights, or to transform norms around internet governance. So I think there's a values element to leading in the reform of the global governance system. There's also a more practical element to it, I think. When you look at sort of China's role in the Arctic, for example, or in space or in maritime sort of governance, I think China and Xi Jinping in particular look at these areas as areas that have yet to be defined, where norms have yet to be sort of concretized, and where China, in fact, can play a larger role. And so, Xi Jinping talks about China, for example, as a near Arctic power, or it's on its way to becoming a great polar power. And I think it was Secretary Pompeo says, there is no such thing as a near Arctic power. You are an Arctic power or you're not, and you, China, are not an Arctic power. I think it's 800 miles or so from Harbin or something to the Arctic. It's far, but the point being that Xi Jinping, they have an enormous research effort underway in the Arctic. They do a lot of exploration of the Arctic. They have invested a lot in Arctic countries for natural resource extraction. They're an observer to the Arctic Council. They put forth a lot of proposals in that capacity. And I think most critically, they talk about climate change, right? Transforming the Arctic, and that this transformation of the Arctic by climate change means it's part of the global commons now and cannot just be governed by those few Arctic Council countries. So that's another way in which China is trying to transform global governance by inserting itself in a new way, reframing the issue so that it opens the door to China becoming a decision maker. So I think what China is essentially trying to do is to say, we have our values, we have our policy preferences, we have our norms. We want to see those reflected. How do we go about doing that? And I think, issue to issue to issue, that's what we're seeing China do at this point in time.
Do you also think that in a certain way, China is kind of emboldened by what's happening in the West? When I was in Beijing over the past 10 years, very frequently I would hear stories about so-and-so from, the U.S. or from UK were in Beijing trying to lobby the Chinese to vote for them in certain multilateral institutions. So I wouldn't name the names, you know who they are. So they just got this sense, we are important. Look, all those people, they're all coming to us trying to get our votes. And on the other hand, as you know much better than anybody else here, Liz, Xi Jinping is convinced that the East is rising, the West is in decline. And part of that belief came from what has happened in the United States and other Western nations over the past few years. So, do you think, in that regard, it's probably not just China driving this, but also what happened in the rest of the world also kind of played a role in here, in terms of China's position?
Sure. I mean, I think, for many years, China was growing very rapidly. There was enormous respect for China's accomplishments. Anytime, a foreigner would go to China to give a speech, inevitably the person would begin by, saying something to the effect that, China has raised $700, 800 million people out of poverty, right? You're always complimenting China, in the beginning, right? Paying some form of tribute. And for us, it was just a nice gesture, but I think for China, they took it very seriously too. But yeah, I think there was a lot of admiration for what China had accomplished, and gradually, I think, not that China began to believe its own press, right? But at the same time, I think this framing that we typically operated under, which is very zero sum, and I think, no offense to you and Tiff, but I think the media plays a huge role in this, which is to say that across almost any issue, whether it's like, clean energy or, the number of patents or whatever it might be, there's this sense that, China has accomplished X, and because China now has done this, that means the US has lost, right? So any gain for China is equivalent to a loss for the United States. And that's a kind of across the board. So I often now, make the point that if China had had the most efficacious vaccines, we certainly would have seen China's, biotech, ecosystem triumphs over the United States and the West, right? They have surpassed the United States. Nobody says the US has most efficacious, vaccines. It has triumphed over China. Nobody does that, right? Because here the US is here and China's coming up. So I think that also contributes to this sensibility somehow that the US is in decline and China's right. Of course, we have things like January 6th. We have a highly polarized society. But as I think that also make it seem as though we are in decline, some form of perpetual decline. But let me make two final points. I think, first, as you certainly know, China is also a very highly polarized society, right? Polarized on ethnic grounds. Obviously, look at what's going on in Xinjiang, in Tibet, even Inner Mongolia. Polarized by gender. Oh my gosh, right? I mean, the online hate directed toward Chinese women, the lack of their participation in the political system, and on and on. Polarized in terms of income inequality. And I think polarized between entrepreneurs and sort of a creative class and the bureaucratic class in China. So, but again, does not get the same kind of attention that polarization in the United States gets. So I think sometimes we just have to look a little bit more closely, a little bit more carefully at what's going on, and start to try to even the scales a bit. And I think finally, just in terms of, Xi Jinping's statement about the East is rising, the West is declining. Again, I think we're very quick to accept what Xi Jinping says. We start hearing this, and again, our media, we're very quick. We have a critical media, right? The media, what's interesting is not just to sort of tout all the successes, but to find out, what's going wrong, where are the divisions, where are the problems. And so I think we're quick to buy into this narrative, but I would suggest that there are a lot of people in China who also don't buy into this narrative. And I certainly have had conversations with Chinese who say they don't believe this. So I take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but to your point about have we contributed to it, I think absolutely we have in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. China is just as polarized as United States is. You just don't see it as, so obviously, because the voices of dissent have been stifled, as opposed to the kind of outlets Americans have in here. That's definitely one area we're also trying to do more stories about the diversity of the Chinese society. So you made a very clear case in your book that engaging with China really is a badly outdated strategy for the US. So what are you recommending to the current administration in terms of their China strategy?
So let's just define engagement if we can, because I think that's important. I think engagement as sort of the broader concept as it operated, basically since Richard Nixon visited China, was really just this idea that by opening the doors to China, by bringing it into international regimes and institutions, by helping China grow, that in fact, China would develop a middle class that would, like other countries, sort of want to have the opportunity to participate more in the political system. You'd end up with economic reform in China as well as some political reform, and China would over time also become a kind of pillar of the international system, of this rules-based order that we discussed earlier. So that was kind of the idea. It's basically modernization theory. And there's Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner, who are both in the Biden administration now and also served in the Obama administration, had a fairly famous article in Foreign Affairs saying engagement is dead. Right? I actually don't think that engagement is dead. I don't think that it was a mistake completely, that somehow we were utterly naive. I think that actually engagement had pretty profound impact on China in some respects. Looking back to an area, again, that I worked on a lot, which was China and the environment, the United States had a huge effect on China in terms of training environmental activists in China, sharing knowledge, just capacity building in general. So I look back at that and think, actually, no, engagement had many positive ramifications, but it did not lead to the end result, the desired end result, that's for sure. But again, of course, history is not over, so we don't know the kind of change that is yet to come to China. But what do I argue now that we should be doing? I think basically, I think about it in terms of sort of four pillars, and being at the Commerce Department has actually really helped me to refine my thinking around this. So, first in terms of just, investing at home, right? Number one is we have to take care of our own house. And so that can mean everything from investing in infrastructure for broadband, across the country, to ensuring that our federal funding of research and development gets back up where it should be. It means thinking about public-private partnerships in new ways, reinvesting in our educational system, providing workforce training, all those things that we know we should be doing, and I think are doing to some extent, but there's always more to be done. So I think number one is just investing at home. Second, and sort of the competition element with China, how do we protect or advance, maybe in a positive way, our economic and national security and human rights, values? And we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and some of them are defensive in many respects, like sanctions, putting Chinese companies on the entity list. I think as China has changed and we see the kinds of new challenges that it poses, we have to adjust our own tools for defending ourselves, right, against Chinese sort of unfair or malign, for example, practices. So what do we think about, moving supply chains, for example? One of the things we saw during COVID was that we can't really rely, not just on China, frankly, but on any other country for the security of the United States. So how do we make more resilient supply chains for critical, whether it's critical technologies or it's, precursors for drugs? So I think that's another part of it. And do we need restrictions, inbound investment, outbound investment, all of these things? Maybe we need to be relooking at the tariffs, sort of the blanket tariffs that the Trump administration levied on Chinese exports, which ones make sense, which ones don't. So I think there are a lot of things that we need to be thinking about in terms of our bilateral economic relationship, and to some extent political relationship as well, defending ourselves against any kind of, Chinese efforts to shape our political discourse, right? Or to steal our intellectual property, all of the things that we know about. I think these are all elements of U.S. strategy that we need to strengthen, but again, also it just need to be smart and targeted. Right? I don't think it does us any good simply to levy these blanket tariffs, right? What do we really need to do to advance our own interests? A third, I think, is obviously working with allies, and this is something the Biden administration has made really clear, and that's, European allies, it's allies in Asia. And frankly, I think we need a really big tent because when you look at what China is able to do, for example, in the United Nations, when we bring, we try to criticize China, censor China for what it's doing in Xinjiang, putting 1 million or more Uyghurs in labor and re-education camps. We could bring 30, 40 countries to the table to join us, and China will bring 50 countries. And so, how do we engage emerging economies, countries in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, countries that typically, or Middle East, we find standing with China? How do we persuade them of the values of the current, international system? Or what do we need to do to reform that system to bring them in, right? I think that's something we also have to be thinking about these days. So I am excited by the extent to which we are engaging our allies in really robust ways in Europe and Asia, but I also believe we need to, as I said, kind of broaden the tent. Then finally, I personally believe there's still room for engagement with China. I think, look, I'm happy that Starbucks has 5,000 stores in China and is selling lattes. I like the fact that, McDonald's and Burger King and KFC are successful in China. I think, why don't we want to export to China as long as those products don't impinge on our economic and national security, right? Why don't we want to export to China? Why don't we want a trade relationship? China, our exports support over 1 million jobs in the United States. I think our brands are good sources of soft power for us in China. So and do we want to try to at least coordinate policy with China on things like climate change? I think we do. I don't think we should trade out other aspects of our policy, for something that China in any case should be doing on climate change. But I don't think that, cutting off relations with China, not just basically saying, there's no point in trying to cooperate. I don't think that that's a constructive route to go. So even though I see China as, competitive, more than competitive, really a systemic, as the Europeans would say, a systemic rival, almost an existential threat, I still think that to the extent we can, we should try to find ways to, if not cooperate, at least coordinate our policy on sort of critical global challenges.
That's super thoughtful recommendation you just gave Liz. I completely agree with you. I do think engagement has worked. Probably not to the extent that was desired by policymakers here initially, but Americans have won hearts and minds of many Chinese, especially my generation, and the leadership's insecurity is pretty obvious, right? I mean, if you read the third history resolution, what really struck me was how insecure they still are after years of strengthening control, party control over society. Is still talking about we should guard ourselves from against Western influence, constitutionalism, stuff like that. I was like, okay, this is really working. But on the other hand, I do see your points that the U.S. definitely has its own national security interests and the interests in terms of protecting the global order the U.S. is committed to. Sounds like China is very hard not to crack here. So here's a question from one of our audience. I think is really a good one. This audience is a participant is asking that China has recently taken a very keen interest in expanding its influence on regional security, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, the very area the US wants to reclaim its leadership. Beijing recently announced a security pact with the Solomon Islands, which has raised quite a few eyebrows. What are your thoughts on the future of the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, given that the US and its allies have also shown their vested interest in the region?
Yeah. So yes, I think it's a good question. This is an area where I think China has scored, as we might say, an own goal. So putting aside the recent pact with the Solomon Islands, calling for the dissolution of the US-led alliance system is one thing, but in fact, China's behavior, I think it's wolf warrior diplomacy, actually, during COVID. It's very aggressive and assertive and oftentimes ugly kind of diplomacy. The boycott of Australian goods, of many of Australia's sort of top exports. And again, China's real assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific actually has made most of the region's actors, most of the region's countries bind themselves more closely to the United States in terms of security than previously. And I think that's a really important point to understand. Not only do we have the traditional sort of allies like Japan and South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines, we now have an entirely new alliance structure, AUKUS, between Australia, the UK, and the US. We have the Quad, which has become increasingly robust and is both to some extent a security based alliance, but has a huge economic component. We have the vaccine diplomacy. So we have the Quad emerging and critical technologies effort, supply chain coordination. So to my mind, while it's true that China did just manage to secure this new security relationship with the Solomon Islands, overall, when you look at the most powerful actors in the region, China's behavior has actually caused them to be more interested, not less interested, in closer ties with the United States.
Thank God to Xi Jinping, wolf warriors.
Well, personally, I'd rather have somebody that was much more interested in political and economic reform and opening to the West. So we say thank God for Xi Jinping, but thank God for Xi Jinping that, yes, when things weren't going well here, he made things so bad in China that, we didn't lose entirely. Yeah.
Isn't that puzzling, right? Perfect opportunity for him to just swoop in and win over all those allies the US traditionally has had. He just did the opposite thing. So, talk about challenges. Obviously China is a huge challenge for the US. And at the same time, also Russia, right? Especially given what's going on right now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do you think, what really drives China to get so close to Russia these days, given the fact that China shares much, much more economic interests with the US and the European countries as opposed to Russia? Yeah.
No, you're right. China's trade with Russia was like $100 million, I think, last year before. In the pre-COVID, I don't know what happened. Everything, all the numbers, got skewed during COVID. So, but right, you're 100% right. But I think the reality is that go back even just a couple of decades, and Russia and China have been working together for a long time in the United Nations. I think after the Russian invasion of Crimea, China abstained in the UN vote at that point in time. I think they looked to each other on a values dimension, right? As it's important, the two of them working together to counter the United States primarily, but also Europe and other, liberal democracies. So I think that drives a lot of that relationship. Russia's also historically provided military support to China, has sold its arms, continued to do so, although China's rapidly rising in terms of its own arms sales to other countries. So at some point they could become competitors in arms sales to third countries. They work together in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They do joint military exercises together. They've drawn in Iran. So, they've begun to form a kind of unholy alliance, in fact, I would say, with other, authoritarian states. So I think that they actually shared a fair amount before Russia invaded Ukraine. My sense, and I think, you yourself said this, that China was not expecting this complete invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I thought it would be a partial invasion, but it kind of got stuck. And the fact that Xi Jinping had that statement, that the relationship with Russia is beyond an alliance, right? That Xi Jinping said a few years ago when he was making a speech in Moscow that Putin was his best friend in the international system. It makes it difficult, I think, for Xi Jinping to break away. But personally, what I find so fascinating is that this has been an area where there has been a fair amount of, debate's probably too strong a word, public debate, but there have definitely been different and dissonant voices in China on this issue, right? Professors calling for Tsinghua to rescind Putin's, honorary degree. Others saying, China's siding, made the wrong choice. It should be siding with the West. So I think it's really interesting. And my guess is that many parts of the Chinese government are not that comfortable. Certainly Chinese scholars are not that comfortable with the decision Xi Jinping made, not to condemn or criticize at all, really, the Russian invasion. So I think China's in a difficult space right now with this. But I think given Xi Jinping's personal relationship with Putin, the degree to which the two countries had been working together, again, that statement at the Olympics, it would have taken some real strength of leadership in many respects to stand up and say, no, I don't support you in this.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. There has been a fair amount of debate inside Beijing about, between bear huggers and bear critiques. But obviously, the decision was made by the very top and driven by the desire, basically, to show the middle finger to the U.S., right? Especially on the Olympic opening day. China probably wrote 90% of that statement, right? Without knowing that Russia would launch such a full frontal attack on Ukraine, and without anticipating how crappy Russian military is turning out to be. So I completely agree with you. There are definitely a lot of debate on lower levels. And obviously, whether or not Xi Jinping will change that policy, will depend on how much wounded he really is from all those crises he's struggling with these days, and what kind of impact it's going to have on the economy, right? We're already seeing Chinese growth plunging so great, at a much greater degree than in decades. So those are definitely key factors that would affect the decision going forward. One thing I just want to maybe add a little bit is that I do think there still is a difference between the Chinese system and the Russian system. Russia political system very much dominated by Putin alone. But I still think China, this party, in a way, could act as a constraint on Xi's power. So yes, he's number one. He's chairman of everything. But there are still limits to his power. So that's what I think is the key difference. And, based on what we just discussed earlier, we will see, whether or not, his influence will be weakened or curtailed going forward. given all those challenges he's facing today in a very crucial year politically. So given that we have 10 more minutes left, I really should give some airtime maybe to our audience. I'm just going to start from the last one. One of our audience is asking, so could you tell us more about the U.S. engagement policy? To what extent should American universities engage with China? A value-based engagement policy, benefit-based engagement policy, or both? This is from a university professor, Sun Pei-dong at Cornell University. Thank you.
Thanks. Sure, Lingling. I just want to note that I think we're supposed to finish at 5 till.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, just I seem
question.
to remember from that excellent schedule they provided us.
Yes, excellent, excellent.
Anyway,
You're more into detail.
Can I,
Am I
can I
right?
just jump in and say this
Yeah.
is such a fantastic conversation. Why don't you go up until 7:59 and I'll do a really quick closing.
Okay. Okay. So I guess when we think about how universities engage in China or with China, I mean, so it's a two-way engagement, right? In terms of Chinese students coming to American universities. And look, absolutely, American universities do and should welcome Chinese students. And so I don't think there's any limit in terms of the welcome that we should give to Chinese students who want to come here to study and to learn and engage with the U.S. system. So I think that's, goes without saying. I think in terms of, what American universities should be doing in China, that's a little bit more, that's a little trickier because I think we want to make sure that what we're doing isn't compromising our values, that we're not constraining freedom of speech. I mean, the value for, as far as I'm concerned, for Chinese students to study in the context of a U.S. university is not just because we'll have great professors or, that they're going to be learning things that they otherwise wouldn't learn, but that they will be able to participate freely, to speak their minds, to really engage with the full American university experience. I think that's very important. So from my sense, I think for a U.S. university, whether it's NYU or it's Duke, or certainly Johns Hopkins SAIS has had such a long and distinguished presence with its Hopkins Nanjing Center. Any of them, I think, should, really maintain what we would consider to be American university governance principles when they operate in China. And I guess maybe I'll make one quick point on looking back at American universities and China, and that is with regard to Confucius Institutes. My perspective is, we didn't have to go around and shut down all the Confucius Institutes, but they needed to operate according to university standards, right? And in university governance principles, which would mean that China does not get to pick the teachers, China does not get to set the curriculum, and the contracts aren't secret, right? So none of those things should have been taking place. If China wanted to provide money to Chinese language department at a university to support Chinese language and cultural training, I'm all for that. But it shouldn't have a say in who's doing the teaching, what the curriculum is, et cetera. So that's just a point that I like to make about, how we engage with China.
Perfect. Do we have time for one more question?
I think so, because we go to 9:59 now.
Okay, I'll go really quick. Again, from a very good question from our audience. So what is the best way for the US and other Western powers to address human rights issues, especially those regarding Tibet and Xinjiang? This question is really important because whenever Chinese officials talk to American officials, as you well know, they would say the sanctions really hurt those workers in China, not necessarily because they deny genocide and all the human rights abuses.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think it's important. President Biden signed into law the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Basically, it just says that any U.S. company that is sourcing from Xinjiang, the presumption is that something that they're bringing in is due to forced labor, and they need to prove that it's not. We don't want our American companies to be complicit in this really appalling abuse of human rights. So I have to say I am supportive of that. I probably even support sanctioning Chinese officials who are directly responsible for this. It sends a message. It is not changing China's policy. I don't actually think the United States, Europe have the power to change China's human rights policy. I think if we were to have an external way to do that, I think it would have to engage countries that have substantial Muslim populations and the emerging economies, because the real pressure that we could bring to bear on China would come from the countries that China tries to say that it's the leader of these countries, right? And if we could actually manage to bring together a substantial coalition of emerging economies, like what happened with climate change, when China changed its position back for the Paris Climate Accord, it wasn't necessarily President Obama, that persuaded China. It was actually a lot of the small island states who stood up and said, you can't claim to lead us. You're the largest emitter. You need to do better. And I think we'd have to have the same thing. It couldn't just be the advanced economies standing up at the UN criticizing China. It would have to be a much broader coalition of countries that included countries that China purported to lead, I think, standing up and saying, we need you to change your policy. And, honestly, I thought maybe ahead of the Olympics, there could have been some pressure brought in a way where China could gradually release some people and say, yes, these people have now been fully re-educated and they can be released. They've received their education. Now they're being released. Then I guess the question is, what happens with those people? What do they say once they're out? And I guess kind of like zero COVID, the path forward is very difficult to see for China because they've kind of backed themselves into a corner.
Right. Thank you so much. I know we're running out of time, Liz, for your awesome insights. Let's all give Liz a virtual round of applause. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lingling, for the terrific questions.
Well, and I'd like to thank you both. I'm Dina Mansour. I'm the executive director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. And thank you so much first to Tiff Roberts for bringing both of you into this conversation on behalf of the Mansfield Center. Thank you, Elizabeth and Lingling Wei, for sharing your expert insights. We could go on for hours listening to your conversation. We definitely at the Mansfield Center appreciate that you had read the Mansfield report, and we'll be looking to do more programs in terms of acting on your 4 points in terms of taking care of our own house, advancing economic and national security and values of human rights, engaging our allies, and engaging China on critical global challenges. You mentioned the Confucius Institute. We actually closed our Confucius Institute in early 2019 because of the challenges that you presented. And one of the challenges that we have in the state of Montana and across the country, I think, is offering Mandarin Chinese and offering the culture, history, and contemporary issue courses that high school students and university students so desperately need so that the United States can actually engage competently with China. So Tiff Roberts is one of the few people in the state of Montana that is offering Chinese history and contemporary issue courses. So grateful to have Tiff here in Montana. So the Mansfield Center will continue to co-host events through May and into the summer. We are partnering with the U.S. China Business Council on May 10th as they present the 2022 export report. On a different but complementary topic, on May 23rd, we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Montana Constitution with We the People community discussions in 9 communities across Montana. So watch for more details on both those events in your email inboxes and on our website. And we absolutely could not offer programs like this evening's fantastic dialogue without the generosity of our funders and supporters. If you'd like to help us continue to foster globally minded leaders of integrity and offer programs on ethical public policy and international engagement, there will be a link placed in the chat box if you'd like to support our work. So thank you all. Thank you to our fantastic speakers. We're so honored to bring you to Western Montana, our state and the nation. And we thank you for sharing your expertise. Good night.
Night.